Good afternoon, everyone in the room and everyone joining us online. I'm Richard Fontaine, CEO of the Center for New American Security. Today we're hosting Wally Adeyemo, Deputy Secretary of the United States Treasury, for a discussion of Russia, the war in Ukraine, and the price cap on oil sales. The Treasury Department has been a key player in a wide range of national security issues over the past year and more. First and foremost has been the response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. And since Moscow launched its war of aggression, the United States has worked closely with its allies to impose costs on Russia and to restrict its ability to prosecute the conflict. A key element in this approach has been the adoption by the G7 at U.S. urging of a price cap on Russian oil. As the Deputy Secretary will no doubt explain, the oil price cap is a novel approach that had two goals: simultaneously to restrict Russia's oil revenues while maintaining the supply of Russian oil that reaches global markets. Overall, the price cap has been relatively successful in this dual mandate, helping keep Russian oil volumes flowing to avoid sudden price spikes and cutting oil revenues at the same time. There remain some questions about it, including ones that I hope we can get into today. For example, how sustainable is this price cap? Is it set at the right level? What is the effect on Russian military outlays? How about enforcement? And so to cover this topic and give kind of an update, the Deputy will kick off the session here with some opening remarks. And then the audience, both in this room and online, will have a chance to ask questions following that. Virtual viewers may ask questions by either entering them into the chat box at cnas.org/live or on Twitter using hashtag CNAS2023. But first, Deputy Secretary Adeyemo, let me turn it over to you for some words. Welcome and thanks for being here.
Thanks. Let me start out by thanking Richard for having me today and for hosting this conversation, but also for everything else the Center for New American Security does in this space to help us think about how we can best secure America's future going forward. Today, as you all know, the brave men and women of Ukraine continue their heroic fight against Russia's unjustifiable war. The United States and our allies and partners are steadfast in our support for the Ukrainian people, providing the Ukrainians with the armed forces with the military equipment they need to defend themselves. And while my colleagues at the Department of Defense are focused on ensuring that Ukraine has weapons to defend itself against Russia's aggression, we at the Treasury Department are working to deny Russia the weapons and materials they need to fight the war of choice with another means. One is by making sure that they don't have the financial resources to do this. Already, our sanctions export controls have made it challenging for Russia to replace the more than 10,000 pieces of equipment they've lost. We have a simple two-part strategy to frustrate Russia's military-industrialized complex. First, to deny the Kremlin's ability to use the funds they have to buy the weapons they need. And second, to reduce those funds and force Putin to make hard choices between funding his war or propping up the Russian economy. Today I want to highlight one aspect of the second prong, the way the price cap policy is cutting Russia's revenue and constraining their war machine. In just 6 months, the price cap has contributed to a significant decline in Russian revenues at a key junction in the war. Now Russia is considering a desperate series of changes to its tax policy that would institutionalize the deepening discount on Russian oil that is brought in part by the price cap policy and the actions taken by the members of our coalition. In December, the price cap coalition, the G7, EU, and Australia, set a limit on the price Russia can charge for its crude oil if it is traded using services from a coalition of countries. That is, if shipments of Russian crude is sold with insurance or shipping from a coalition country, it cannot be sold for more than $60 a barrel. And because 90% of global shipping insurance and a majority of financing and payment services for the oil trade are provided by these countries, this creates a powerful incentive to comply with the price cap. This policy is designed, as Richard said, to accomplish two goals that might otherwise be in tension: to lower the revenue Russia receives from its oil exports while keeping Russia's oil on the market. At the onset, the price cap was met with doubts that it would be workable. Today, there is clear evidence of its success, a testament to President Biden and Secretary Yellen's leadership and success in building a global coalition, as well as our ability to work hand in hand with the private sector. Russia's government oil revenues in the first 5 months of 2023 are down nearly 50% from the year prior. This decline in oil revenues has occurred despite the fact that Russia is exporting more oil today than it did at the onset of the war. Despite higher export, Russia is making less because its oil now trades at a discount of 25% relative to other global oil. The success of this policy benefited consumers globally as well. In addition to promoting energy market stability, it has provided leverage to buyers of Russian oil, who are predominantly emerging markets, by setting a ceiling on what Russia can get elsewhere. Beyond the data, there are clear signs of progress. Look at what the Russians have said themselves. The Russian finance minister has cited the price cap as a driver of reduced tax revenues and their ballooning budget deficit. Analysts from Russia's central bank have said the price cap and EU sanctions present new economic shocks that could significantly reduce Russia's economic activity. In addition, Russia is reportedly pursuing changes to the way it taxes oil to respond to the divergence between Russia's oil and the global market price. This change will constrain Russia's oil companies going forward, leaving them with fewer funds to invest in exploration and production, and over time, diminishing the productive capacity of Russia's oil sector. Let me provide some important details about the steps the Kremlin is contemplating to put a floor on the revenues losses caused by the price cap. Instead of continuing to tax Russian oil sales based on the market price of Russian dominant blend of oil, Urals, the changes the Kremlin has proposed would calculate taxes assuming a price that is a fixed, significant discount to Brent, the global benchmark. Under this approach, Russia's oil firms would see their taxes go up even as the price cap continues to drive their actual revenues down. Let me be clear. The Russian government is prepared to implement a tax regime for its most valuable commodity that locks in a massive discount because of the impact of the price cap and the collective actions of our coalition. This illustrates well the very difficult choices our sanctions and export controls had forced the Kremlin to contemplate. When it comes to the price cap, either Russia continues to accept the steep discount that our actions have imposed on their energy exports, or they institutionalize it themselves with these changes to their tax regime. No matter which choice they make, they will have significantly less revenue to fund their war than they did before the price cap was put in place. As you know, the Kremlin is also investing in building its own seaborne oil ecosystem in order to ship oil without using Western services. For example, the Russian central bank has guaranteed about $9 billion in reinsurance schemes intended to replace Western reinsurance. This is money the Kremlin cannot invest in tanks and other weapons to fight its war in Ukraine. Money that is going away from the war is money that is helping the Ukrainians be in a better position to make sure that they can defend themselves. While we do not see widespread signs of evasion, we know Russia is seeking ways to evade the price cap, as well as our other sanctions and export controls. We are laser focused on preventing invasion in collaboration with our coalition partners in the private sector. For example, in response to suspected evasion, insurers and flagging registers have stopped serving ships companies whose activities present an unacceptable risk. And even in spite of their evasion efforts, the data is clear that Russia today is making less money from oil than it was before the price cap was put in place. While we will continue to take actions to reduce Russia's revenues, as I said earlier, we are also focused on making sure Russia cannot use the money it has to buy the weapons the Kremlin needs to fight its illegitimate war. Again, against the modern equipment Ukraine is using on the battlefield, Russia is in some cases fielding tanks designed and built in the 1940s and 1950s, among other obsolete technology, due to the historic sanctions and export controls our coalition have put in place, which are disrupting Russia's access to ammunition, electronics, and other goods necessary to power Russia's war machine. I want to be clear to companies, individuals, and countries that we in our coalition will hold accountable those who provide support for Russia's war effort. Our work is not over. We will continue working with our coalition partners to take the steps needed to support the people of Ukraine against the illegitimate invasion. I want to thank you again for having me today, and I look forward to my discussion with Richard and to your questions.
Great, thank you. Let me sit down here. Okay, so let's get the conversation started, and I'll ask the deputy a few questions, and if there are questions in the room or online, I have this nifty iPad, which I may take home with me, that has ability to get the ones from our virtual audience. So maybe we can start with some of the skepticism that has been talked about over. There was widespread skepticism at the very beginning of this oil that this seemed kind of too good to be true. You know, yeah, we want to reduce the price and also we want to reduce the revenue and increase the volume. So you talked about the price of oil and the volume of oil toward the beginning of the conflict compared to now. How do you know the price cap is responsible for that? So Brent's at like, what, 74, 75. If the Russians were taking a 20% discount, irrespective of the price cap, that'd put it right about $60 anyway. So what's the thinking about the cause being the price cap as opposed to different market dynamics?
So I do think that one of the things that we've been fortunate about is that we've seen energy prices overall come down over time. And I don't think that this is without some of the policy decisions we've made here. For example, the president's decision to use the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, which put more oil on the market. The fact that we've done a lot to increase supply here in the United States and around the world. But fundamentally, when you look at where Urals are trading today versus where they were trading before the price cap, it's clear that the price cap is having a significant impact. Urals before the war were trading nearly at the same level as Brent, almost to the dollar. Over the course, in the beginning of the war, there was a huge discount to Urals, which closed over time. And at one point, Urals and Brent were trading over $100. Today, the gap between Brent and Urals has expanded significantly, and that happened after the price cap and Europe's sanctions went into place as well. And I think part of the challenge that Russia faces today is that they have bad options. They no longer have as many places to sell their oil, and they have fewer vehicles to move that oil in. And the people who are buying recognize that Russia has a cap on the ability to sell oil using Western services, and they're using that to negotiate lower prices with Russia. And that's why we've seen the price of Urals, where we've been able to see price discovery be so low relative to Brent and other grades of oil.
And then in terms of, so the reducing the revenue that goes to Russia from oil sales is an intermediate goal, right? Because the ultimate goal is to reduce its ability to make war in Ukraine to the extent that it would be possible in the absence of that revenue. And you talked about some of the tensions that Russia is under and the way it's trying to think through this, both from a tax perspective and things like that. Have you yet seen kind of tangible results of the reduction in revenue when it comes to the war-making potential? Are there things that Russia wanted to buy or fund or something that was unable to do, or do you see the stress on the non-military side? It pulls from one to the other, or is this a longer-term kind of thing where we have to wait for this to sort of bite in a tangible way?
I think the best example of where we're seeing this is in their deficit. Russia today does not have enough money to pay its bills, full stop. They're having to borrow from themselves and from their sovereign wealth fund to make up for the gap that's been created by having to spend more money on their war effort in Ukraine, but earn less money from selling what has been their cash cow for a long time, which is oil, which has been driven by the policy actions we've put in place. So you're seeing the impact today, and it's forcing them to make harder and harder choices. And those choices will get harder over time. But a big piece of this is that we know that Russia is going to have some level of money because they're going to continue to do activities that will generate it. But in addition to the price cap, which is reducing that money, we're very focused on making sure that the money they have, it's harder for them to use it to buy the things that they need to fight the war in Ukraine, which is why we're focused on evasion and ensuring that they don't have access to the goods that are necessary to rebuild the 10,000 pieces of equipment that they've lost in the war.
And then how sustainable is the price cap? Can this be sustained indefinitely? And are you seeing different reactions to it from countries that are not part of the price cap coalition. I mean, on the one hand, lower prices is great for them. On the other hand, this is foisted upon them like some of our economic policies tend to be, particularly through the mechanism of if you're going to use G7 country-related insurance and shipping mechanisms and so forth. So one, how sustainable do you think this is over time? And then two, what are you hearing about the reactions from countries depending on where they stand on all this?
So one of the things that is powerful about the price cap regime is that it aligns the incentives of everyone except the Russians. The purchasers, many of whom are emerging market economies, who saw the price of energy go up significantly when Russia invaded Ukraine, which had a huge impact on inflation in their countries. And for many of these countries, buying energy is one of the most important things for their citizens. They want a cheap source of oil. And now that you have a price cap in place, it both puts them in a position where they can buy that oil cheaply using Western services. But if Russia is able to build up their own ecosystem, it also puts these countries who may be purchasing in a position to negotiate a low price with the Russians, saying that they know the alternative is to sell within the price cap coalition. So what we've heard from a number of these countries, especially both in the government and also their private sectors, is both an acceptance of the policy, but also an acknowledgement that the policy ultimately benefits them. If you're an African country that is an oil importer, you have, when I've seen the finance ministers from countries in Africa or Latin America, they've complained about headline inflation and the cost of energy imports. This is going to benefit them. Ultimately, for Russia, the reason they're pumping more oil is because they need more money, and they're making less for each barrel that they're pumping. So they're the ones who are struggling with this policy, but ultimately, the people they're selling to like nothing more than buying cheaper oil, because they also recognize that the reason they're buying expensive oil was because of Russia's war of choice in Ukraine.
And does that suggest that you're not worried about the development of non-G7 service providers because the interest flows in the direction of using those that would also provide the price cap lever in terms of the negotiations?
I think the reason that we are less worried about that is two reasons. One is, in order to build up that ecosystem, it's quite costly. So the Russians have to, I mentioned the $9 billion figure in terms of what they've had to do to build up a reinsurance agents, but they also have to buy ships. These ships are not cheap. They need to also build up a finance ecosystem, and all of this is very expensive. And one of the benefits we have in the system that's already been created is that it is a huge volume business. So the G7 ecosystem that both provides insurance but also shipping doesn't only ship for one country or one grade of oil or diesel. They do it it's a global business. For Russia, they're really trying to build up an ecosystem that will support them and maybe other rogue actors, but that's going to be expensive for them. So that's money they have to invest. I've already told you they're in a deficit to try and build up an ecosystem, and it's money they can't invest in the war. In addition to that, even as they build up this ecosystem, to your point, Richard, the countries who are buying for them in this alternative ecosystem are still trying to negotiate the lowest price possible to buy their oil, because they know that Russia's alternative is to ship using G7 services at $60 a barrel. So the transparency provided by the price cap also is helpful to those countries who are buying outside of the G7 services.
Let me ask a couple more questions and then turn if there are questions in the room or online. And so there's an interesting paper out, I think last week or the last few days, from the National Bureau of Economic Research on this, and it looked at the supply of Russian oil and actually found that the Russian supply, first of all, Russian supply curve is extremely inelastic. It may even be downward sloping, which for the non-economists among us basically means that at a lower level of price, then they would be incentivized actually to increase production rather than decrease it. If you translate that into this, that would suggest the possibility that the price cap goes lower. You go to $45 a barrel instead of 60 or something like that. You would actually increase Russian supply and further reduce revenue. Is there thought about moving the price cap target at all, or how do you think about this as this continues?
So our goal is to try and deny Russia as much revenue as possible while continuing to encourage them to produce as much as possible. So we're always exploring what we do next. And I think from our standpoint, one of the things that we've seen is that the way that Russia has responded, and I outlined this in my remarks, is that Russia has seen the impact of the price cap, and now they're considering changing their tax regime, which is a clear sign that it's having an impact on their revenues. And they're moving away from a tax regime on their oil industry that's based on the revenues that their industry's earning based on selling their oil, because they see that falling and they think it'll fall over time. And they're changing the tax regime to one that's based on the price of Brent with a discount, which is them really institutionalizing the fact that they don't expect in the short term for them to be able to sell oil at the price that other global oil is trading. So trying to find a way to institutionalize and put a floor on what has become a diminishing asset for them over time. So I think our goal is to make sure that we're in a position where we continue to find ways to deny them revenue as the Russians try to adjust their tax regime to deal with the challenges of the price cap. But the goal, in addition to trying to make sure that they're denied revenue, is to force them into a set of hard choices. Hard choices like, do we spend more money on ships? Do we continue to raise the taxes on our oil industry in a way that starves them of the money they need to invest in going out and producing more oil over time in order to pay for this unjustifiable war in Ukraine? And also, how do we make it harder for them to get access to the goods they want to buy with that money that they're taking from their oil industry? Are the things that we're trying to do, and we're open to and considering a number of different approaches that will make the hard choices they already face even harder going forward.
There's a couple of questions. Actually, there's a question here in the room. So I think there are mics around, so if you wait just 1 second for the mic to arrive and then identify yourself, and then there's some online that I'll get to as well. So please go ahead.
Brianne Deppish with Washington Examiner. I was actually going to follow up on that paper. At the very end, they suggested that a price cap over $45 a barrel might encourage Russia to build up its shadow fleet or allow it to build up its shadow fleet. What is the U.S. opinion on that, and are there concerns there?
So I think our view is that what we're trying to do is ultimately, to Richard's point earlier, is our goal is not only to reduce the revenues that Russia is earning from selling oil, but to reduce the revenues they have to fight this unjustifiable war in Ukraine. So ultimately, the fact that they're investing in building up their own ecosystem for selling energy, we think is a way to reduce the revenues they have for fighting the war in Ukraine. The fact that they've made this tax change is a clear sign that they see the impact of the price cap as being one that's significant, and they're trying to put a floor on that impact by changing the way they tax their energy industry from being based on euros, which our price cap has definitely impacted, to one that's based on Brent, which is the global price. The thing that they are doing by institutionalizing this discount is they are saying to their energy companies, even if you are making less money because of the American price cap, we're still going to charge you a tax that will take away from your ability to generate profits that you can use to reinvest. So over the medium and long term, we see the price cap that we've put in place as an effective means to deteriorate their industry, while at the same time putting them in a position where they have to face the hard choice in this exact moment of whether they produce more energy, and by producing more energy, make a bigger investment in building up their own ecosystem, which will be money they can't spend on the war in Ukraine. So we think right now we've struck that right balance, but we're open to thinking through what we do going forward to further adjust to making what is already an incredibly hard choice for the Kremlin and for their oil industry even harder going forward.
Okay, here's a question from John online. It's from a little bit of a different direction. So he asks, with OPEC Plus now cutting production to boost prices, has the price cap been too successful? Does this create a, quote, price floor for the policy? So has your policy been too successful, Deputy?
I think, as you said, and the thing to remember, just to step back, is that sanctions, export controls, these are all tools in service of a broader foreign policy objective. And our objective is to end Russia's invasion of Ukraine as quickly as possible, and to make sure that the Ukraine has the support they need to defend themselves. So until we're in a position where that ends, we're going to continue to think through how we use not only the price cap, but all of our tools to further limit Russia's ability to be an aggressor in Ukraine and to support the Ukrainian people as they defend their country.
There's a question from Christian. How does the news today that Rosneft is preparing to sell massive forward oil contracts impact your view of the effectiveness of the oil cap. I think my understanding is the forward contracts are not covered by the price cap. Is that right?
So I think the as usual, the details matter here, but I think
we're a think tank, for God's sakes. Go for it. And we love details.
So my sense, I won't opine about an individual trade that Rosneft is making, but what I will say is that it fits within the larger picture that we're attempting to paint here, which is that Russian energy companies are trying to find ways to lock in profits, lock in prices, lock in relationships in response to what has been a difficult environment for them overall, where they are further constrained because they have fewer places to sell, they have fewer ways to move the goods that they're trying to sell, and now they're in a position where their government is potentially going to charge them a tax irrespective of at what price they sell. So they face a number of, in a moment where this industry overall has done quite well over the last few years, the Russian energy industry faces a number of headwinds that are creating headwinds for the budget of their country, and our goal is to continue to drive up those headwinds in a way that also drives them to want to produce more energy to lower the cost for all of us around the world.
You talked about the incentives for everybody but Russia aligning on this. The economic incentives for China would seem to align this. Geopolitical ones, maybe not, because they want to see Russia succeed in this war of aggression for their own geopolitical reasons. What has been the Chinese reaction to this, or how do you see the Chinese factor, both economically and geopolitically, in this effort?
I think the thing that I've seen in terms of what the data has shown me is that to date we haven't seen China provide at scale material support to Russia's military, but we have seen China do what they've done in so many other circumstances, take advantage of an economic situation. And to date, what we've seen is that China, in many ways, have purchased things from Russia that have been relatively cheap to make sure that they have access to cheap oil, because like any other importer, they've struggled with high prices. And they need energy to be able to meet the demands of their people. And ultimately, China, like any other country, views the price cap and sees it also as a potentially negotiating lever when they have conversations. Is what I would expect them to do as any other country would.
There's a question right here, so Mike will come over.
Hi, Dan Flatley with Bloomberg News. I had a question about evasion and enforcement.
Really
wow.
hear you now.
Excuse me. I think it was in April that OFAC issued some guidance about spoofing or messing with geolocation for ships. Are you still seeing evidence of that? How widespread is it? Do you know whether that's primarily a Russian practice, or is that being done by other providers? And along with that, on enforcement, do you anticipate that you'll need to do some enforcement on the price cap, or does this sort of basically just police itself? Thank you.
I think part of this, to your question, is that, and I mentioned this in the speech, one of the things that have been the most successful in terms of this policy hasn't only been the international coalition we've built, but also the work we've done with the private sector. Ultimately, when you think about this, the insurance that is provided for seaborne oil, 90% of it comes from the EU and the UK. And financing and payment settlement for energy, primarily done in the West. So what we've done is that when we've seen evidence or potential evidence that something nefarious may be happening, we've went quickly to industry and talked to them about, and to flagging jurisdictions and said, we've seen ships in your jurisdiction do X, Y, and Z, and to a flagging jurisdiction, to insurance company, they then have taken actions to go investigate what's happening and take steps to try and correct where the behavior has been seen to be nefarious. And I think as I said earlier, their incentives are also aligned with ours, because the last thing they would want is to be in a place where they're not compliant, or the ships that they're providing insurance to or flagging are non-compliant. And we've seen them take actions in that regard. What we're trying to do is trying to provide as much information as possible to industry so industry can act, but we also want to make very clear to those companies that are attempting to, those ships, those individuals who are trying to evade these sanctions, that we're prepared to take actions against them as well, individually. But the power of this approach using the price cap has been truly the fact that enforcement in large part has been done with industry and working to build a compliance regime that industry has found they're capable of helping us to enforce. And in the cases where in the future we see that companies or groups of companies are taking actions to violate the price cap, we're prepared to use our tools to go after them. Not just here in the United States, because I think one of the most important points here and one of the valuable things here is that many of these ships are insured by companies in the UK or companies in the EU. And those jurisdictions have worked very closely with us to monitor and be prepared to take action as well.
There is a question from Rachel who asks, what measures are you taking to make sure that Russia struggles to capture funds for more elevated shipping costs? And then I guess a separate but related question, are there security or environmental risks from the older shipping infrastructure?
Yeah, and I think to the second part of that question, I think that is something that ports and others have to be aware of, is that older shipping infrastructure does create risks, and you need to be mindful of making sure that the ships have the appropriate insurance and the ships are appropriate going forward. And I think that it is something that we're mindful of, and I think that's why fundamentally the vast majority of shipping in the world still takes place using ships, insurance, and financing that's provided by the same ecosystem. Ultimately, the elevated shipping cost is something that we're paying a great deal of attention to, but we see it as a sign of the success of the policy, not a weakness, because frankly now Russia has fewer options in terms of how to ship their oil, and shipping companies know that, so they're going to charge them more money to ship. The key, though, is to make sure that that money is ending up in the hands of these companies, not in the hands of the Russian state. To date, what we've seen is that we've seen shipping companies be able to charge a larger amount, not just because Russia has fewer options, but also because their routes are far longer. Traditionally, Russia was selling a great deal of its oil to Europe. Fairly quick trip for the Russians to make. Today, far more of that oil has to go further, either to Asia or to Latin America or even to parts of Africa. That's going to cost more in terms of shipping. It's going to take longer. It's going to mean that that ship can't return and pick up more oil as quickly. We're monitoring this closely to make sure that we're not seeing extremely elevated prices. But what we've seen to date is consistent with the idea that while Russia's revenues have went down for selling oil, their costs have significantly went up. And I think one of the things that people haven't paid enough attention to is how much those costs have gone up. And now they're about to see their costs go up at a moment where their government is telling them, we're going to tax you more, so that it creates just another headwind for the Russian energy industry.
Yes, sir.
From K2 Integrity. My question is, what are the benefits of the price cap approach compared to what we had in previous programs, which was the significant reduction exception?
Yeah, I think what we found to be the benefits of the price cap approach here has been that it has led to greater market stability by establishing a price that creates the right incentives to both reduce revenues but encourage a maintenance of market supply. And at a moment where supply has been quite tight, and one of the things that we were trying to solve for was the idea that whenever, for example, I met with a finance minister from developing or emerging market economy, one of their primary concerns was the increased price of food and energy, both caused by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. By taking the approach of the price cap, we put ourselves in a position where for those countries, when it came to energy costs, especially oil costs, now you had an alternative where you could buy oil that was at the cap. And an important thing that people often fail to realize is that, and they have more ability to buy it as well, because G7 countries have largely banned the import of Russian oil. So we're not directly benefiting from the import of Russian oil. It creates a real opportunity for developing market economies to buy this. That would not have been possible if we had went with an approach that was a significant reduction approach over time. It wouldn't have encouraged continued production. It wouldn't have created the same opportunities for price stability that we've seen throughout the market.
I imagine those conversations with some of those countries are easier now than when you're trying to argue over what constitutes a significant reduction and the case for making it on sort of broad geopolitical, international order, non-proliferation, those sort of grounds.
You were definitely
right. Let's see, there's another online question here from Mark. How do you assess the trade-offs in encouraging Russia to build up its own ecosystem, for example, hastening the development of non-US dollar payment systems? This is a question you get with almost any form of sanctions, but what do you think about that?
I think the thing that the Russian government has found to be true is that it's extremely hard to get away from the dollar. In 2014, when I was in government and Russia invaded Crimea, we took a set of actions then, and Russia in response decided that they were going to move their central bank assets out of the United States. And they were going to try and put themselves in a position to withstand sanctions if they were to come in larger quantities later on. As we were getting ready towards the end, I believe, of 2021, to think about what we would do if Russia invaded Ukraine, we did the analysis, and we saw that even despite Russia's best efforts, for their biggest bank, on 80% of their FX transactions, they were still involving the US dollar. It's extremely hard to get away from the dollar, and they're finding that now. In terms of trying to set up a payment channel in other currencies, it's quite hard to find another currency that is as universally used as the dollar, and it helps that within our coalition, you have the vast majority of the world's convertible currencies. So the other currencies you're able to pair with, oftentimes, when you're in that currency, you can only buy things from that country in that currency. So you're not really getting a convertible currency that allows you to do business around the world. And that's what has allowed our coalition to be so successful, is the fact that it doesn't only involve the United States, the dollar, which is still the most significant currency around the world, but our partners, be it the pound, the euro, the yen, these are the other currencies that are easily convertible into other currencies, which is what Russia needs in order to function, to have a well-functioning economy. And as we step back, it's important to remember that today, Russia's economy looks nothing like the economy they had just a few years ago. And it's an economy that's becoming less flexible, less able to grow, and its greatest source of wealth, its commodity sector, its oil now, is in a state of panic because they are facing increased cost, lower revenues, and at a moment when their government is talking about increasing their taxes.
Yes, ma'am, right here.
Thank you.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Kemi Oshikoya from the Africa Bazaar magazine. So you already spoke a little bit about the reaction regarding Africa. So I was wondering if you could talk about South Africa, especially given the relationship between Russia and South Africa. What is your view? And also, GOP congressional members are calling for sanction on South Africa. Can you also share your view about that?
So my view here is South Africa, like every other country, has faced challenges from Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And we think, like every other country, there are true benefits to the end of Russia's invasion for South Africa. You look at what's happened in terms of price pressures in that economy and the impact it's had on the South African people. Ultimately, for South Africa, for all of Africa, for the world, we would be better situated if the invasion ended as soon as possible because of what it would do to reduce the pressures on food and on oil prices. South Africa has been an important partner to us on a number of fronts, and we look forward to continuing to work with them as we work with other countries to make sure that we both live up to the rules of the road that we've all agreed to, but also ensure that material support isn't provided to Russia going forward.
We have time for one or two more questions before we let the Deputy Secretary get back to the people's work. So if there's not some in this room, I may ask them. One, you talked about the denial of the necessary ingredients for Russia to continue and to expand its energy sector. Are there plans to do more to try to restrict Russia's ability to import the items it needs for its energy sector?
So we've done a great deal in terms of degrading Russia's energy sector, the ability over the medium term to be able to get access to some of the cutting edge technologies that are critical to production. And we think that that's going to have a long-term impact on Russia's energy sector and their productive capacity. And I think we're always interested in looking at what else can be done there, with our goal being doing the two things that we have in the near term that we've cared about, which is reducing their revenue and also making sure that we're creating incentives for them to continue to produce, given that we want to make sure we have stable markets. But we think that the actions we've taken in terms of export controls since 2014 and during their current invasion of Ukraine are having an impact on their ability to build out a well-sustained energy sector there. And we're going to continue to work with our allies and partners to think about what other creative things we can do to restrain their ability to grow over time.
And then my final question is on how sanctions on Iran and sanctions on Russia might fit together, given that, you know, we have some symmetrical objectives with these two countries, and they certainly have lots of joint objectives, including providing military equipment to Russia, which it uses to kill Ukrainians and much more besides. So the U.S. government is in the business of enforcing all of the Russia-related sanctions and sort of regimes that you talked about, and enforcing the Iranian sanctions. When it comes to the oil sector in both of these countries, how do those things fit together or not?
Yeah, I think the truth is that today we have two very different regimes, but both of them are restraining both countries' ability to be economically successful. And our goal has to be to continue to use our enforcement of these regimes in a way to both create the type of stability in the market, but also to restrain their ability to take steps that will allow them to be economically successful going forward. And that requires, I think, to our point, enforcement and vigorous enforcement. And from our standpoint, when it comes to Russia and how we think about the regime when it comes to the price cap, that's working very closely with the insurance industry and also with the flagging industry to try and make sure that we're able to enforce. When it comes to Iran, that is really looking at financial flows and also thinking about how we can cut off some of the networks that they've set up that have went underground over the years to try and sell oil at very steep discounts. So while they're related, the ways that we're thinking about going after their methods are somewhat different, but all of them are reliant on the idea that ultimately, in order for them to survive, they need to try and find a way to get around our regimes. And the thing that makes our regimes powerful is the fact that it's not just the United States is enforcing them, but we're doing it with our allies and partners. And our goal is to make sure that we keep those alliances strong in order to make sure that they don't have places to turn.
And so you've got similar objectives with Russia and Russia and Iran, but you got very different regimes in order to achieve that objective. As you look, I mean, this price cap idea was new. No one had done this before. Now, as you look at the efficacy and wisdom of the one versus the other, does it suggest to you changes in either one or the other?
No, but I think what it does say is that we have a variety of tools and ways that we can meet our objective. And I think one of the things that people often do is they look at sanctions and they think that sanctions are an objective all to themselves. Ultimately, what sanctions should be, what they must be, is they must be a tool in the service of a foreign policy objective. And once that foreign policy objective and strategy is designed, the goal then must be to think through what tools can we provide the president as he thinks through what he wants to accomplish. And now, in addition to the other tools that we've had in the toolkit, we think that we have this tool that we've been able to use with regard to Russia, and specifically in these circumstances, just with Russia, because of the actions that they had taken, this was a tool that made sense. Ultimately, our goal is not to use sanctions and export controls, but rather to have countries that take steps that are consistent with our national security, with our national security interests. But when the time comes, we want to make sure that we've used these tools thoughtfully. And I think that what we've learned from the last 6 months is that the price cap has been an effective tool. It's one that's been effectively used against Russia to constrain their ability to earn revenues that they can use then to fight their war in Ukraine, and we plan to continue to use that tool.
Wally Adeyemo is the Deputy Secretary of Treasury. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thanks to all of you, and please join me in thanking the Deputy.